Welcome to this explainer. Okay, what if I told you that a single hidden truth might just connect every major religion on Earth? I know, it's a huge, bold question, right? But today, we're unpacking a set of seriously intense and complex philosophical texts that try to completely reevaluate the entire spiritual history of humanity. The author of our source material presents this wild, sweeping framework that challenges basically all traditional dogmas. It really pushes us to look at the fabric of reality and, our place in it through a radically different lens.
The historical dialectic and the secret Torah. All right, let's dive right into this fascinating framework. These texts attempt to completely redefine human history, the very origins of existence, and what spirituality actually means. We'll be exploring what the author calls the historical dialectic alongside this really intriguing concept they call the secret Torah. Whether you consider yourself deeply religious, strictly secular, or anywhere in between, these ideas are absolutely designed to make you stop in your tracks and question the stories we've all been told about our past.
To get through these dense concepts, we're going to follow the source material's own structure, which borrows from the Hegelian dialectic. So, we'll cover 1. The monad and its partition. 2. Religion as elite control. 3. Prophets and the secret Torah. 4. How true holiness means being whole. And finally, 5. Achieving the final synthesis. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The monad and its partition. The origins of conflict.
So before we can even begin to understand human history, the texts argue we have to understand the original state of the universe itself. They propose that absolutely everything began as what philosophers call the monad, basically the primary, ultimate, simplest substance. Think of it as a perfect, undivided unity of existence way before any duality or conflict ever existed. It's the ultimate source of everything. But, there's a catch. Because it was perfectly unified, it was also completely solitary. According to the author, the monad actually desired the experience of the other. It wanted to experience a story, to play, to interact. But here's the problem. You can't exactly interact if you are literally the only thing that exists, right?
The author uses this fantastic, super modern metaphor to explain what happened next. They describe the division of the one monad into partitions, like a computer disk is partitioned. I love that analogy. The monad didn't literally shatter into pieces. Instead, it divided itself internally. By creating these partitions, it created the illusion of separation. And just like that, suddenly there is a me and a you. There are subjects and objects. And naturally, whenever you throw competing wills into a shared space, boom, you generate the potential for conflict.
And that brings us to the absolute core engine of the author's philosophy. We started in step 1, the thesis, which was pure, undivided unity. But partitioning the monad thrust us straight into step 2, the antithesis. Now, this transition makes conflict totally endemic and unavoidable. But the text insists this conflict isn't inherently evil. Actually, scratch that. It's more like it acts as the necessary engine for all human experience. Think about it. Just like a movie absolutely needs a villain, or a circuit needs electrical resistance to generate power, existence needs conflict to generate experience. The goal here isn't to go backward. It's to push forward to step 3, which is the synthesis.
Section 2. Religion as elite control, the antithesis phase.
We are currently living deeply inside this antithesis phase right now, and the author makes a massive claim here, that this natural, necessary conflict was actually weaponized by human institutions to gain power. Now, maintaining radical neutrality here, we are looking at a very harsh critique. The text argues that organized religions across the board were essentially designed by elites and priest classes purely as political tools. The source claims these institutions demand arbitrary submission, impose rigid dogmas over actual evidence, micromanage human life, centralize absolute wealth, and use what philosophers call noble lies. But they use these lies not to uplift people, but to enslave the masses. It's framed as a systemic exploitation of our natural state of conflict.
But, and this is crucial, the author notes a profound duality hidden within all of our history. The sources draw this incredibly sharp contrast between those controlling institutions and what they call the secret Torah, where organized religion relies heavily on external authority, rigid dogmas, strict hierarchies, elite control, and historical manipulation. The secret Torah is entirely different. It's based on internal authority, radical honesty, universal love, authenticity, and transparent truth. It is the actual liberating message that, supposedly, the institutions have constantly tried to bury.
Moving to Section 3, Prophets in the Secret Torah, the Hidden Thread.
Even amidst the heavy control and manipulation of that antithesis phase, a counter-message has somehow continually survived.
The author emphatically argues that this secret Torah isn't just, one physical book locked in a dusty vault somewhere. No, it is an underlying truth hidden in plain sight within every text, every culture, and every major religion ever established. The text suggests that true seekers, people who approach life with radical honesty and deep empathy, can actually scavenge this secret Torah from right within the corrupted texts of history. It's like a giant puzzle waiting to be solved.
Looking historically, this really builds chronologically. The source material argues that figures like Akhenaten in Egypt, Zoroaster in Persia, the Buddha in India, and Jesus in the Middle East, alongside figures like Krishna, all independently scavenged and reintroduced this exact same anti-dogmatic teaching throughout time. They weren't trying to create new systems of control. They were desperately trying to wake humanity up to the secret Torah. They were reminding us of our shared origin back in the monad and teaching us how to manage our conflicts through universal love.
Section 4. True holiness means being whole, healing the partition. This brings us to a super radical redefinition of what it actually means to be a spiritual person within this framework. Because if religion is just about control, what is true spirituality? Well, the text uses a really fascinating piece of etymology here. It argues that being holy has absolutely nothing to do with religious obedience or wearing specific robes or reciting dogma. Instead, the author claims that holy literally just means becoming whole. It's the process of integrating your fractured self. Remember that partitioned monad we talked about earlier? Holiness is the personal journey of healing that internal partition.
So, to heal those internal partitions, the source insists we really have to do the hard psychological work. We have to drop our social disguises and all those personas we wear. We have to stop lying to ourselves and to others and start practicing radical honesty. This means fully validating our true, authentic experiences, even the really painful ones, and expressing authentic dissent and truth. It's all about accepting life exactly as it is without denial and integrating every single part of the psyche, not just the parts that society deems acceptable or polite.
And when you truly become whole, your outward behavior shifts dramatically. The texts argue that the simple act of cleaning a floor or cooking a meal with the pure intention of serving others is vastly more sacred than the grandest, most elaborate religious ritual performed for status or ego. The intention to ease the suffering of another partitioned being, that is the ultimate expression of this secret Torah.
Section 5. Achieving the final synthesis, the Eden Protocols. All right, this is the grand resolution of the dialectic. How we collectively transition from the chaotic conflict of the antithesis to the ultimate synthesis. The author proposes a solution they call the Eden Protocols, which relies incredibly heavily on Zen principles. By treating all sentient beings with deep empathy, we bridge the isolation of our partitioned minds. By actively resolving and managing potential conflicts, rather than trying to dominate each other, we harmonize competing human wills. And by emulating Zen principles of selflessness, we step into that final dialectical synthesis. It's a state where we remain distinct individuals, sure, but we exist in total, complete harmony.
Now, reaching this synthesis requires a massive shift in how we live our day-to-day lives. It means acting completely without ego. We have to actively suspend our dogmatic judgments of other people, silence that endless internal dialogue of self-pity, and behave with impeccable humility. And I think this is the most beautiful part. The author suggests we must return to a state of pure play. That means engaging with the world not for some selfish ulterior motive or some promised future reward, but simply for the pure joy of the experience, exactly as the monad originally intended when it first partitioned itself.
As you digest these incredibly intense, paradigm-shifting perspectives from our sources, I really want to leave you with this final thought. Ask yourself honestly, are you living an authentic, integrated life right now?
All right, let's just jump right in. Today, we're doing a deep dive explainer on something pretty sprawling and honestly highly controversial. We're looking at Marcus Heinrich Rehbach's Welcome to the New World Order quadrilogy. Now, right off the bat, I want to make something crystal clear. We are absolutely not here to endorse, validate, or debate the political claims in these texts. A lot of this is incredibly fringe and provocative stuff. What we're doing instead is taking an impartial, architectural look at the material. We're just going to map out the internal logic of the author's universe, breaking down how he builds his arguments, from his critique of history to the radical, utopian alternative he ends up proposing.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the core premise, move on to defining the cult, check out the mechanisms of control, look at how the author rewrites history, and finally, dive into the Eden Protocols.
Okay, Section 1, the core premise.
So the absolutely crucial thing you have to grasp right from page 1 is the author's overarching worldview. This text argues straight up that a hidden elite has been executing a massive, multi-millennia strategy. We're talking a 3,000-year-old plot designed to end in absolute global dictatorship. According to this narrative, literally every modern crisis you can think of, economic crashes, global health events, none of them are random. They're all carefully orchestrated steps toward what the author calls a new world order. Basically, in this universe, there are zero coincidences. Everything is just a manufactured piece of a very, very long game.
Moving on to Section 2, Defining the Cult.
Now, to actually navigate this quadrilogy, including its prequel, you really have to learn the author's highly specific vocabulary. The main antagonist here is a group he calls the Cult of Judah. But what's really fascinating, and you have to pay attention to this distinction, is how painstakingly the author tries to separate this alleged elite from everyday Jewish people. The text frames its critique heavily around themes of Zionism, essentially painting it as a tool of this cult. But it explicitly claims that throughout history, everyday Jewish populations have actually been the primary victims and the strongest opposition to this elite group. The author sees this cult as a sort of parasitical force that just uses everyday populations as pawns.
Another huge piece of the puzzle is a term the author uses called the golem. Now, you know, in traditional folklore, a golem is an animated, unthinking creature made from mud, right? Well, the author takes that and turns it into a metaphor for the modern media, military, and political complex. According to the text, this massive complex is basically an unthinking machine. It just swallows the con of fiat paper money and executes the orders of these central elites without ever questioning a thing. Which brings us to Section 3, Mechanisms of Control.
So you might be wondering, if this elite exists and the golem is their tool, how exactly is this global control pulled off? Well, the author outlines a very specific three-step economic conspiracy. Step 1. The elites use central banking systems to print endless amounts of fiat money right out of thin air. Step 2. They take all that limitless paper wealth and buy up global mass media, creating this unified propaganda machine. And Step 3. Through institutions like the IMF, they seduce individuals and even entire sovereign nations into taking on massive unpayable debts. This effectively plunges the global population into debt slavery and forces nations to just hand over their sovereignty. Honestly, this quote right here brilliantly captures the author's intense focus on economics. Let's just let the text speak for itself. The central bank printing presses are the true philosopher's stone. Just like that mythical stone was supposed to turn base metals into gold, the author argues that printing fiat money lets central bankers literally conjure power and ownership out of nowhere. It turns worthless paper into absolute control over humanity. It's a real game changer in his narrative. And you see this kind of systemic thinking a lot in the books. The author loves using structural and scientific analogies. Take a look at the schematic of an electronic circuit. It's a transistor amplifying a signal. He uses this exact concept to map out how the media, military, political complex amplifies the power of the elite. He actually describes society as an engineered inversion of reality, a system purpose-built to reflect the ambitions of these hidden architects. All right, Section 4, Rewriting Global History. Okay, now we're getting into one of the most controversial aspects of the entire explainer, the intense historical revisionism. The text presents this wildly alternative timeline. It actually goes all the way back to 1000 BCE, reinterpreting biblical events like the Babylonian exile as early political strategies of the cult. Then it jumps to 1913, framing the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve as this massive critical coup. It goes on to engage in extreme WW2 revisionism, asserting that official histories were totally fabricated by the victors to hide their own crimes. And moving into the modern era, it claims 9/11 was an engineered false flag and frames the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic as a manufactured exercise in global compliance and terror. Like I said, incredibly controversial claims. To justify all this, the author explicitly borrows that famous concept from George Orwell's 1984. Who controls the present, controls the past, controls the future. The argument here is that the elites who won the wars and control the present just systematically wrote the official history textbooks to retroactively justify everything they did. In this view, official history isn't fact. It's literally just the propaganda of the victors. Finally, Section 5, the Eden Protocol's solution. So you'd think this whole quadrilogy is just about detailing a dystopian nightmare, right? But actually, the author pivots completely to propose his own radical utopian countermodel. It's a stark contrast. On one hand, you have the new world order that he fears, dystopian austerity, endless debt slavery, and constant manufactured warfare. But on the other hand, you have his proposed alternative, the Eden Protocols. He describes this as a universalist, strictly vegan, synergistic, and honestly almost post-human society. A place where the whole predator and prey cycle, both literally and economically, is totally broken.
The bedrock of this utopian vision is this really fascinating philosophical concept he invented called the optimal ethics generator. The claim is that if society just adopts this incredibly specific ethical framework as its core motivation, it'll automatically replace all that opportunistic exploitation with true synergy. And we're talking indivisible justice for all sentient beings here, not just humans.
So what does a society actually look like when it's running on the Eden Protocols? Well, according to the text, it means the total elimination of violence and a strictly enforced vegan society where animals are no longer exploited at all. It promises an absolute meritocracy and the total dismantling of what he calls beneficiary classes, so no more billionaires, no more hidden elites. And then, in this wild sci-fi twist, the text suggests these protocols could actually be implemented and monitored globally using programmable nanobots. Which brings us to the visual branding of the whole philosophy. This is the logo for TROONATNOOR, which is the publisher's imprint for the author's works. It's an acronym, and it stands for the reality of our natures and the nature of our realities. It just goes to show that the author doesn't see this as merely a political critique. It's meant to be a totally holistic lifestyle philosophy. Imagine if literally everything you've ever been taught about getting sick was just a lie. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a completely objective, structured deep dive into a highly controversial and complex piece of literature. We're going to map out the architecture of a grand conspiracy theory, breaking down its scientific, historical, and sociological claims to understand exactly how the author constructs his worldview. So, the source material we're unpacking today is Marcus Heinrich Rehbach's book, The Virus Deception: Rule by Medical Myth. In this explainer, we're basically acting as your tour guides through the author's very specific architecture of belief. We aren't here to endorse or debate the claims, but rather to unpack the material and show you exactly how he built his argument, starting all the way down at the microscopic level of cellular biology up to a grand millennia-spanning historical narrative. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our clinical roadmap for today. 1. The virus deception. 2. Exosomes versus viruses. 3. The PCR test critique. 4. Medical appropriation. And finally, 5. The Nakash conspiracy. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the virus deception, framing the official narrative. Right out of the gate, the foundation of Rehbach's entire book is a total, fundamental rejection of modern virology. He actually calls it an official narrative constructed just to maintain control. His premise is totally uncompromising. He states, the real conspiracy this book exposed is that a small group of people, a medical mafia, have conspired to create and maintain a myth. Viruses are purely mythical creatures. According to the text, viruses do not exist in the real world. They're just a theoretical idea, a myth created to serve as a blank check for what he calls a medical dictatorship. Moving right along to Section 2, exosomes versus viruses, a cellular redefinition. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is, if viruses aren't real, how does the author explain the biological particles we actually see under microscopes? Well, in the official virology narrative, viruses are exogenous, meaning they come from outside the body to attack healthy cells and replicate. But Rehbach argues the exact opposite. He claims these particles are actually endogenous, created internally by our own cells. He refers to them as exosomes, which he describes as natural byproducts of our immune system, basically generated to clean up cellular damage caused by environmental shocks, toxins, or stress. To try and ground his exosome theory, the author points to real scientific literature, specifically referencing geneticist Barbara McClintock's 1983 Nobel Prize-winning work. The text uses her research on how environmental shocks can naturally alter cellular DNA to argue that the tiny fragments of DNA virologists claim are viral invaders are in reality just the body's natural trauma responses. He's basically arguing that virologists are just looking at the debris of our own immune system and completely mislabeling it as an invading pathogen. Which brings us to Section 3, the PCR test critique, breaking down the diagnostics. Having redefined the biological particles themselves, the author then transitions his attack to the primary diagnostic tool used in modern medicine, the PCR test. According to the text, the PCR test is structurally flawed and totally unfit for diagnostic purposes. He methodically lists out several alleged mechanical failures.
First, he claims the PCR process just amplifies inert or dead matter that cannot self-replicate or infect anyone. Second, he argues that running these tests at high cycle thresholds, anything over 30 or 35 cycles, yields completely meaningless results. Third, he asserts that because a true virus has never actually been isolated, PCR tests are calibrated using computer-generated artificial Frankenstein DNA. And finally, he posits that the tests can be pre-configured, kind of like rigged scratch-off lottery tickets, to artificially generate false positives or negatives just to drive public fear.
To bolster this massive critique, the text leans heavily on a quote from Kary Mullis, the actual Nobel Prize-winning inventor of the PCR process itself. The author uses Mullis's own words that PCR doesn't tell you that you're sick to argue that the medical establishment has deliberately misused this technology to construct the illusion of widespread viral infections.
Next up is Section 4, Medical Appropriation, the Illusion of a Pandemic.
So this brings us to a fascinating question. If viruses aren't real and the tests are totally invalid, how does the text explain the reality of widespread illness and death that the public actually experiences? The answer is a concept the author coined himself, medical appropriation. According to the text, the medical establishment steals the symptoms and deaths from already existing conventional conditions, things like seasonal flu, lifestyle illnesses, or chronic diseases, and falsely rebrands them as symptoms of their new imaginary virus. Let's move to and see how this builds into what the author calls the virus playbook. It's a 4-step process. Step 1, authorities find a random, harmless DNA fragment. Step 2, they manufacture a PCR test to massively amplify it, creating millions of false positive cases. Step 3, the medical appropriation. They bundle the symptoms of everyday illnesses and attribute them to this fragment. And finally, Step 4, they use the resulting panic and inflated case numbers to dictate unprecedented public health measures, lockdowns, and economic controls.
And that leads us to Section 5, the Nash-Kosh conspiracy, the grand motive. Up to this point, we've explored the microscopic and the mechanical claims. But to understand the why behind this massive alleged playbook, we have to zoom all the way out. The text introduces a highly charged antagonist, the Nakash. The author defines Nakash as an ancient symbol of a serpent coiled around a pole. He claims this symbol represents a 3,000-year-old conspiracy orchestrated by what he terms the cult of Judah. According to the source material, this hidden elite maintains absolute control over 2 main pillars of modern society: global finance, which he links directly to the dollar sign, and the global medical profession, linking it to the caduceus or the rod of Asclepius, used by organizations like the WHO. It's right here that the author weaves his alternative cellular biology into a grand socio-historical conspiracy. He reminds the reader that the entire medical dictate, the PCR tests, the virus myth, the lockdowns, is really merely a secular weapon. It's supposedly a modern tool utilized by this ancient cult to achieve global enslavement, centralized power, and establish a new world order by driving nations into debt slavery through economic wrecking. The author literally connects the medical and financial worlds into a single apocalyptic vision, writing, "Welcome to the New World Order. 3,000 years in the planning. The serpent coiled around the pole. The dollar symbol, universally recognized and associated with finance and medicine. The 2 halves of the pincers now closing tight upon us." To try and validate this immense claim, the author constructs a massive historical timeline, seamlessly weaving ancient religious history with modern virology and current events. His timeline starts 3,000 years ago when Moses supposedly erected the Nakash symbol in the desert. Then, he jumps to the 1950s, where he claims virologists basically faked a consensus to invent infectious viruses. In 1993, the PCR test gets legitimized by a Nobel Prize, setting the stage for diagnostic manipulation. And finally, this all culminates in 2020, which the author describes as a Mockster Greifung, a total power grab orchestrated under the guise of a pandemic.